Think you know Henry VIII, the guy with 6 wives who founded the Church of England? Well, buckle up, because the real Henry VIII was so much worse than any history textbook dares to tell you. A king so grotesquely obese that he needed mechanical devices just to move around. A man whose rotting leg wounds smelled so horrific that servants would literally run away gagging. A ruler whose own body was falling apart so dramatically that his coffin exploded from the gases of his decomposing corpse. You're about to discover the shocking curiosities about Henry VIII that make Game of Thrones look like a children's fairy tale. From his bizarre eating rituals to his paranoid security measures, from his treatment of wives that went beyond mere execution to the grotesque reality of his final years, these are the facts that will change everything you thought you knew about England's most infamous king. His body was a walking disaster. Let's start with the most shocking truth about Henry VIII. By the end of his life, he was literally a walking corpse. We're talking about a man whose body had become so grotesque that even his own servants were traumatized. Henry's waist measured 54 inches. To put that in perspective, that's bigger than most people are tall. He weighed around 400 pounds in an era when the average man weighed maybe 140. But here's the truly horrifying part. It wasn't just obesity. His legs were covered in festering, open wounds that never healed. These weren't small cuts. We're talking about massive ulcers that oozed pus and rotted flesh continuously. The smell was so overwhelming that courtiers would hold perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces when approaching the king. Some historical accounts describe the stench as being detectable from several rooms away. Servants actually drew straws to determine who had to help dress him, because getting close to those wounds was considered a form of punishment. But wait, it gets worse. Modern medical experts believe Henry suffered from a severe traumatic brain injury from a jousting accident in 1536. This wasn't just a bump on the head. He was unconscious for 2 hours, which in medieval terms meant he was practically dead. The injury likely caused massive personality changes, explaining his transformation from a relatively normal young king into the paranoid, rage-filled monster of his later years. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but Henry also probably had a condition called Cushing syndrome, which would explain his dramatic weight gain, mood swings, and those horrific leg ulcers that refused to heal. His own doctors were so terrified of him that they wouldn't dare suggest he might be seriously ill. Criticizing the king's health was considered treason. The man who claimed divine right to rule couldn't even control his own bowel movements in his final years. Royal attendants had to carry special chairs everywhere he went because Henry could barely make it from room to room without having an accident. This is the same guy who executed people for looking at him the wrong way. 2. The wives had it even worse than you think. Everyone knows Henry VIII had 6 wives and executed 2 of them, but the reality of what those women endured goes far beyond a simple beheading. We're talking about psychological torture that would make modern serial killers jealous. Take Anne Boleyn. Before her execution, Henry didn't just decide to kill her, he orchestrated an elaborate frame-up that included forcing her own musician to confess under torture to having an affair with her. But here's the truly sick part. Henry made Anne watch as 5 men, including her own brother, were executed for allegedly sleeping with her. She had to stand there, knowing she was next, watching innocent people die because of her husband's paranoid fantasies. Catherine Howard got it even worse. She was basically a teenager when Henry married her, and when he discovered her past relationships, he didn't just execute her. He passed a law making it treason for anyone to marry the king without revealing their sexual history. Imagine being so petty that you changed the entire legal system because your teenage wife wasn't a virgin. But the psychological games were the worst part. Henry would shower his wives with gifts and affection one day, then completely ignore them or threaten them the next. Catherine of Aragon spent her final years essentially under house arrest, forbidden from seeing her daughter Mary, while Henry spread rumors that she was mentally ill. She died alone, possibly poisoned, writing letters to Henry that he never bothered to read. Here's something that will blow your mind. Henry actually forced his wives to sign documents agreeing to their own divorces or annulments. Anne of Cleves was so terrified of him that she agreed to a fake marriage annulment just to avoid execution. She basically had to pretend their marriage never happened and thank him for the privilege of not being murdered. And Jane Seymour, the lucky one who died of natural causes? She died from complications after giving birth to Henry's son, and Henry was already eyeing up his next wife before Jane's body was even cold. He waited exactly 9 days after her funeral to start planning his next marriage. The man treated human beings like disposable objects, and the worst part is that these women had absolutely no escape. Divorce wasn't an option. Running away meant death, and fighting back meant not just your own execution, but potentially your entire family's destruction. 3. His eating habits were absolutely insane. If you think competitive eating is crazy today, wait until you hear about Henry VIII's daily food consumption. This man didn't just eat like a king, he ate like he was trying to single-handedly cause a famine. Henry consumed roughly 5,000 calories per day. For context, that's more than double what an active adult male should eat. And remember, this guy could barely walk by the end of his life. But the sheer quantity wasn't even the weirdest part. It was what he ate and how he ate it. A typical meal for Henry included an entire roasted pig, multiple whole chickens, several types of fish, mountains of bread, and enough wine to float a small boat. His kitchen staff prepared over 800 different dishes every single day just for his household, with Henry personally sampling dozens of them. The royal kitchens employed over 200 people working around the clock to keep up with his appetite. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. Henry was convinced that certain foods had magical properties. He believed eating swan would make him more graceful, consuming large amounts of deer would make him a better hunter, and that oysters would enhance his, performance with his wives. So he'd gorge himself on these specific foods in massive quantities, like some kind of medieval superfood obsession. The man also had the strangest eating rituals. Every single piece of food that entered Henry's mouth was first tasted by multiple servants to check for poison. But get this. He was so paranoid that he required his food tasters to wait 30 minutes after eating before he'd touch anything, just to make sure they didn't drop dead from delayed-acting poison. Henry's meals were basically theatrical performances. He'd eat in front of hundreds of courtiers, and the whole process could take up to 4 hours. Imagine sitting there watching this massive rotting king slowly work his way through enough food to feed a small village, all while pretending this was perfectly normal royal behavior. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but Henry actually banned certain foods from his court, not because they were unhealthy, but because he thought they were beneath his royal status. Common people's food like turnips and barley were literally illegal at his table, even though they probably would have been better for his health than the mountains of meat and sugar he consumed daily. The truly insane part? Even as his body was literally falling apart from his diet, Henry kept eating more and more, convinced that his royal status somehow made him immune to the consequences of his gluttony. 4. The paranoia that ruled an empire. Henry VIII's paranoia wasn't just your typical trust-no-one attitude. This man turned his entire kingdom into a surveillance state that would make modern dictators jealous. By his final years, Henry was so convinced that everyone was plotting against him that he transformed royal life into a living nightmare for everyone around him. Let's start with his sleeping arrangements. Henry slept with loaded crossbows next to his bed and kept multiple daggers under his pillow. But that wasn't enough. He also had armed guards stationed inside his bedroom, watching him sleep all night. Imagine being so terrified of assassination that you couldn't even close your eyes without witnesses. The palace itself became a fortress of paranoia. Henry ordered the construction of secret passages throughout every building he lived in, not for romance or convenience, but so he could escape if assassins came for him. He had peepholes installed in walls so he could spy on his own courtiers, and listening devices hidden in meeting rooms to eavesdrop on private conversations. But here's where it gets truly insane. Henry created an entire network of spies whose job was to spy on his other spies. He had informants watching his informants, creating this twisted web of surveillance where nobody knew who they could trust. Court life became a psychological horror show where saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could literally get you executed. Henry's food paranoia reached absolutely ridiculous levels. Not only did he have multiple food tasters, but he required his meals to be prepared in completely sealed kitchens with guards watching every step of the cooking process. The salt, the spices, even the water had to be tested by different people. He was so convinced someone would poison him that eating a simple meal became a military operation. The man even suspected his own children of plotting against him. He had spies watching Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, his own daughters, because he was convinced they were planning to overthrow him. These were children, and he treated them like enemy agents in their own home. Henry's paranoia got so extreme that he started executing people for crimes they hadn't even committed yet. He'd have someone killed because he dreamed they betrayed him, or because someone else suggested they might be disloyal in the future. The Tower of London was constantly full of people whose only crime was existing near Henry while he was in one of his paranoid moods. The truly terrifying part is that Henry's paranoia was so contagious that it infected his entire court. Nobles started spying on each other, servants betrayed their masters for imaginary rewards, and everyone lived in constant fear that they'd be the next victim of the king's delusional suspicions. 5. Death couldn't even stop the chaos. You'd think Henry VIII's reign of terror would end with his death, right? Wrong. This man was so committed to being a disaster that even his corpse managed to cause absolute mayhem. Let's start with his final weeks. Henry was so massive that he couldn't walk, so his servants had to carry him everywhere using a specially designed chair with pulleys and wheels. But here's the disgusting part. His leg wounds had become so infected that pieces of rotting flesh would literally fall off his body as they moved him. Servants had to follow behind him with cloths to clean up the chunks of decomposing king that dropped on the palace floors. His death scene was like something out of a horror movie. Henry's body had swollen to such grotesque proportions that his skin was stretched tight and shiny. The smell was so overwhelming that even his doctors, who were used to medieval medical horrors, had to leave the room to vomit. When he finally died, nobody wanted to get close enough to officially confirm he was dead. But wait, it gets so much worse. Henry's body was so bloated with gases from internal decomposition that his coffin had to be specially reinforced. They wrapped his corpse in lead sheets and sealed it in multiple wooden boxes, thinking that would contain the mess. They were very, very wrong. During the funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle, something absolutely incredible happened. The coffin literally exploded. The gases from Henry's decomposing body built up so much pressure that the lead lining burst open and rotting royal remains splattered all over the inside of the hearse. The smell was so horrific that the funeral procession had to stop, while servants cleaned up the mess with buckets and rags. Here's a detail that will haunt your dreams. Dogs were reportedly seen licking up the remains of Henry VIII that had leaked from his coffin onto the road. The man who claimed to rule by divine right ended up as dog food on a country highway. Even his burial became a disaster. They had to dig his grave extra wide to accommodate the massive coffin, but the ground kept collapsing because the soil couldn't support the weight of all that lead and rotting flesh. It took multiple attempts just to get the king's remains into the ground and keep them there. The chaos didn't end there. For years afterward, people reported strange noises and terrible smells coming from Henry's tomb. Some claimed it was his ghost, but historians think it was probably just more gases escaping from his continuously decomposing remains. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but Henry's death was so traumatic for everyone involved that several of the servants who handled his body died within weeks, possibly from infections they caught from contact with his rotting corpse. So there you have it, the real Henry VIII. Not the charismatic king of popular culture, but a walking disaster whose own body betrayed him as dramatically as he betrayed everyone around him. A man so consumed by paranoia and gluttony that he turned one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms into his personal horror show. The most powerful man in England became a prisoner of his own decaying body, and even death couldn't end his capacity for causing absolute chaos. His legacy isn't just the Church of England or his 6 wives. It's a masterclass in how absolute power can turn a human being into something genuinely monstrous. If these disturbing royal facts made you question everything you thought you knew about history, maybe hit that subscribe button. Because there are plenty more horrifying truths that textbooks conveniently leave out. And trust me, you haven't heard anything yet.